this one I think is gaining a little bit of momentum in different spaces. But the obvious question is, look, why does contemporary society privilege science? I've got the example of STEM here, particularly over other curriculum areas. I mean, you tune in and you see that the federal budget, they're allocating money, obviously, to get different parts of the demographic of Australia into science, and obviously there's a fair bit of money heading towards this space around STEM. And so I think it's a legitimate question to ask.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
Well, I think the issue has a really long history, and that's that science. I mean, one way to think about it is that science has proved its worth. It's proved a valuable way of dealing with the world in such a way where what gets proliferated are ways of solving problems and creating new ways of being, if I want to use that existential term. So science is incredibly successful, even from an economic point of view. And I think that's gone hand in hand with, people are very suspicious of the idea of civilization, but it's gone hand in hand with the idea that human beings are now have accessible to them a much greater repertoire of ways of being, either through technology or and through science, health sciences, for example. I mean, we just live longer, and so we see in a kind of tangible, embodied way the result of science. Now, if you then look at that from a lens of a sort of capitalist lens or from an economic lens, and you say, well, that's very good. Science it seems to be a kind of an enterprise which allows for innovation and allows for improvements. So built into it is a kind of feedback mechanism where you have an innovation that allows you to access more resources, intellectual resources. You can use those to then buttress, further exploration. And so it's a kind of it promises this kind of exponential growth in access to the world, and of course, exponential growth appeals to anyone who's hell bent on this idea of progress. So I think the story of science and the story of progress, as measured via the proxy of economic growth, just means that it is the language, if you like, of power. It's the language of growth, of potential, of exploration. Now, you can have all sorts of critiques of that. You can have a Marxist critique of that. You can have a postmodern critique of that. Yeah. But I think in a very sort of broad brush sense, there's undeniably a strong correlation between science and this idea of moving up in the world. It's interesting to note that, for example, in highly developed countries, the population of young people are less interested in science than those in developing countries. And I think it's because people in developing countries see science as the mechanism for progress.
Sure.
And so that means that one would want to give some sort of privilege to any area which has a track record in delivering what it is you want. Now that means, of course, that if you change the rules and change the values, then science might have a different place. But I think that's what it is. So in terms of social mobility, economic growth, it's not surprising that the STEM disciplines have this kind of allure. But going back to what I said earlier, the other thing which is very tempting about science is that if you view science as giving you access to this universal, indisputable, objective reality, this metaphysical space called nature, the universe, the observer-independent world. It's from a metaphysical point of view, it's very, very appealing. So I think the power of science is that it has this metaphysical allure, and this economic
Sure.
one.
For some people, I can imagine they would be attracted to notions of certainty with these systems.
Yeah.
But if anyone who knows anything about science knows that they're actually not certain at all.
No. In fact, the uncertainty is built into it. I mean,
Yes,
I know
of course.
that you're familiar with Popper's work. I mean, the idea is that you're not there to set up these truths which are kind of going to stand, for 1,000 years. But what you're trying to do is set up the conditions for things to fail. Because I guess
Well, you're doing your goddamned hardest to try and kind of fail or test.
Yeah.
Test whatever it is that
Yeah.
is claimed to be the truth.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes science really difficult, is that it requires a huge amount of humility. So I think that perhaps it's a disservice to science and science education to continue this idea that the purpose of science education is to get students to encounter how exciting and wonderful science is, rather than saying, actually, the science is a kind of a systemized exercise in tragedy and kind of disruption, and it's a real painful process. And the only thing that saves you from going mad in that process is a dedication to the process itself, is a dedication to saying, I could be wrong, and I need to test it out against the world and other people. And if everyone does that, to some extent, science has resolved, the scientific community has resolved a political problem, is how you get people to agree to a particular method which is not its own dictatorship, that one voluntarily submits to the scientific method, not because it promises truth and certainty, but the opposite, because it promises a dedication to humility, to kind of testing yourself out against the world and other people.
Yes.
So it's a safeguard against certainty. It's a safeguard against arrogance, and quite frankly, it's it's the same problem in philosophy. There are not very many people who can genuinely subscribe or dedicate themselves to a discipline that asks that of them. So I think that's So I think perhaps in some ways STEM should be more admired, but for reasons other than just the economic or the metaphysical underpinnings of it. Yeah.
Of course. All right, now I'm looking at the time. We've got about 5 minutes. We've gone a little bit over, but that's okay.